Hi guys, so today's video is going to be my January monthly wrap-up. I did do a mid-month wrap-up. I also did a new releases wrap-up, as well as some dedicated reviews, a live show, all those sorts of things. So I'm going to link all of those down below, and I am going to give maybe a little bit more general thoughts on those ones and focus in a little bit more towards the books that haven't gotten dedicated reviews or that I haven't had the chance to talk about as much. So I'm going to start with those, and those would be Ray Bear and Underground Railroad. I know that I primarily read fantasy, as do a lot of you, so I'm going to start with Ray Bear. This is a YA fantasy that I actually think would work really well for people who sometimes like picking up YA but generally prefer adult fantasy, as the world is very interesting, and I also feel like there are things touched on that are more serious in nature, as well as having quite high stakes. I was really impressed. This is a debut, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I had such a good time with it, but also there were parts that were very surprisingly emotional for me. The setup for the story is we follow a single point of view. It is a young girl. You start out with her as a child, and then you spend the majority of the book with her being a little older in her teenage years, as is to be expected from a YA book. Our main character, Tarisai, is born to a woman through basically making a wish with a djinn-like being, and then therefore by having this child be an extension of somebody who can grant wishes, the mother essentially makes the daughter, she puts on her this wish, this command to kill the son of the current ruler. And you don't really know why. You don't know why she's so determined to have this individual killed and why she would go through all this to force her daughter into this through this command, but it is somewhat binding and magical, and our main character doesn't really know what she's getting into because she lived a very sheltered life. She really doesn't know her mother very well, but through some unusual circumstances, she finds herself in an opportunity where she can become this individual's counsel, most trusted beings who are responsible for making that man immortal, except for she will be the weak link that not only jeopardizes that, but has the opportunity to kill him. I found the premise to be so interesting, but my goodness, does it touch on quite a few things. There's a number of times that I tabbed it because I was really, I was really hit by some of the things. We also have a character who is a side character, but you see the repercussions of them living in a household that wasn't particularly kind and loving, quite the opposite, and how protective they are of their mother, and oh my goodness, did that get me? I almost cried. There's just a part where they just say one simple thing, and I was like, oh no, it's okay, it's gonna be okay, except for things aren't always okay, because this book has quite high stakes. It just was so much heavier than I was expecting, while also maintaining some of that optimism and entertainment factor that you get so often with YA, and it's quite short. I read this basically in one sitting, and now I can't wait for the sequel. Getting to Underground Railroad, though, this is definitely not entertaining whatsoever. So the setup for this story is that it is almost historical fiction. It takes place in America. We have slavery and it's horrific. So the thing that makes this exceptionally fictional is that the Underground Railroad is a real Underground Railroad that some people are trying to use to gain freedom. And we follow a runaway slave. It was probably one of the most tragic things, if not the most tragic thing that I have ever read. It was not easy to read because it was one horrendous, horrifying, terrible thing after the other. It was just, but it's not one of those things where the author is just imagining, oh, what's the most grotesque thing I can think of? That's what I'm going to have happen. No, these are the sorts of things that happened. The writing style does have a sense of detachment. It is almost like you are reading, I don't want to say it's a textbook. It's not quite to that extent, but it's almost like you are reading about terrible things that have happened, and then you're zeroing in on some individuals that has happened to. So it's like if you read a story from the newspaper about somebody and you're like, man, that's sad. But instead of just reading about it, you kind of sort of follow them as they experience it. So it's not going to be as personal as a lot of other stories are. I don't really know what reason Colson Whitehead had for making that choice, if he did it so that we could try to stomach some of the things that are occurring and be able to read it and be able to glean certain things from this, or if it was a reflection of what those sorts of things happening does to a person and the sense of detachment you have to have from just your humanity or your emotions. Like, you have to almost shut yourself off just to be able to go through those things or to witness those things and still have hope and to still try and to continue trying to live. It was very tragic. It was so difficult to read, but I do think it is a very important read. I really don't know how I would normally like to review something like this because I think it is exceptional and worth picking up, but I also don't know how to do that because I don't know how. I mean, normally when I talk about books, I talk about things like, I liked this, I didn't like this, and I don't feel like this book is, its purpose doesn't feel like it's to entertain or to have something that you just pick up casually. It is something almost to be eye-opening, even though we're aware that these things existed and occurred and are terrible and people suck. It just helps you recognize how barbaric human beings can be. Let's switch to something a little cheerier. A Vow So Bold and Deadly. This is the third book in the Cursebreaker trilogy, the first being A Curse of Dark and Lonely, which is a Beauty and the Beast retelling and a portal fantasy, meaning that our main character is from our world and then ends up in a fantasy world. It is so much fun. It is nonstop addictive. You don't want to put it down. Our main character is feisty, but also introspective. Sometimes they say things too quickly and then they think about it and they're like, oh shoot, you're right, that was a little rude. And I'm like, I like when characters can grow. It's great to see. But also you find yourself frustrated because sometimes you're like, just talk to each other, just get your feelings out. And then once they do, they grow from it, which is, again, appreciated. But I had such a good time with this trilogy as a whole. I only read this third one in January. I'd already read the previous two. But I said in the past that I can't really say specifics about my feelings because it will give away a little bit the tone of the ending. But ultimately, I did think that this was a solid wrap-up to this trilogy, and I quite enjoyed it. Next up, we have Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. This is the fourth installment to his First Law world. So you have the First Law trilogy, and then this is the first of the standalones. You technically can read this on its own, but I would highly recommend reading the original trilogy first. It will have a lot of things in it that you will appreciate having read that trilogy first. But this story at its core is a good old revenge story. And I, right away, felt for this character. Joe Abercrombie, everybody says his character work is great. Completely agree. It is fantastic. I wanted revenge for this character, but this book very much throws in your face, hey, are you sure that revenge is really worth all of the chaos that you are creating and all the people that you are hurting along the way? And honestly, as the reader, you're like, probably not, but it's kind of a horror show. You can't look away. You sort of want them to keep going even though you don't. And it was very entertaining despite being usual grimdark. Things are super violent, super explicit, but very entertaining. And I will say I was a little frustrated because I think certain elements of the story became a little predictable and almost felt, I described it as edgy for the sake of being edgy, just a little bit, but it wasn't enough to make me not enjoy the story. Next up, we have Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This is the third Novik book that I have read. I enjoyed the first book in the Temera series quite a bit. I did not care for Uprooted, and I was nervous to pick this one up. But all of you said, hey, even if you don't like Uprooted, you should still pick this book up because it's very different. And you all were correct, 100%. I loved this one. It is definitely folklore-esque, so the magic in it is soft. We follow a character who is living in our world, but a different time period where ladies don't have a lot of say. And this book is honestly about the quiet ways in which our awesome female characters try to triumph under the circumstances that they find themselves in. And I loved it. The main character is somebody who has to collect money from other people, so they don't really like her. But she's like, I gotta do what I gotta do. I have a family, my dad, my mom, I gotta help take care of them. And I loved her so much. But she finds herself attracting the attention of basically a fae king, and she has to try to fulfill some tasks for them, and then other things ensue after that. It is a fairy tale retelling. I enjoyed it so much. You do just kind of have to accept certain magical things at some point. I feel like you can't think too hard, like, wait, but if this is possible, then is this possible? Or if this isn't possible, then that shouldn't have been able to. You can't really go into this book like this. It is very fairy tale-esque, very folklore-esque, so you just kind of have to be along for the ride. I also want to add that I really appreciated Naomi Novik's way of showing the Jewish people, because our main character is Jewish, and the things that they had to face within their community. It's just not something I find you see very often, despite the fact that so much of fantasy is European inspired. You don't really see that aspect. So I really appreciated seeing it. I think it was woven into the story beautifully, and I really liked this book. I was really surprised. It's also a fantastic winter read. Very, very atmospheric. On that note, we have The Bear and the Nightingale. This was also an extremely, extremely atmospheric read. While I think this one made me feel the cold, not literally of course, but essentially feel the cold, more so than Spinning Silver, I would also say you could pick this up as a fall read because it's a little creepy. I was really surprised when I first started the book. I was like, I see why everyone recommends this for winter. It's very cold and wintry feeling. And then the further you get, you're like, this is getting kind of scary. So the folklore elements in this one are like people not exactly staying dead, that kind of a vibe. It also has a fae element to it, but both books, the fae are not like, I'm really sexy and look at how beautiful my eyes are, and it's not those kinds of fae. The prose in this is stunning. The writing is beautiful. I do think that this has a sense of detachment a little bit because it very much feels like you are being told a story. So it doesn't feel as character driven, which is usually not to my liking, but I still found myself very captivated by this. The writing style is so different from what I normally like that that's the only reason that this wouldn't be an absolute favorite, but I highly recommend it. And even if you do have taste similar to mine and you're not sure if this would be an ultimate favorite, I would still give it a go. It is so beautifully crafted that ultimately I think, why not? But a little bit about the setup. We follow a character named Vasya, and she may or may not have some magical abilities and also may have attracted the attention of some not great magical beings. And so she is trying to help her people, her family, while they look at her and they're not so sure how they feel about her because there's this interesting clash of the folklore elements with religion. And I don't know, it was well done, but a tiny bit scary, I gotta say. Next up, we have a nonfiction book that would be Atomic Habits. This book is all about how to implement small changes into your life that are going to have remarkable results. And I don't know if I can say too much about this because I am trying to implement some of the things that this book advises. Although for me personally, I am accustomed to some of the practices that it encourages just from having a background in learning an instrument and then reaching a somewhat advanced level. I mean, I majored in music. I used to teach private violin lessons. That was my career from the ages of 17 until now, as I have recently transitioned into no longer doing that. Thanks, COVID. But anyway, this book, I still would say there are things in it that could definitely be helpful to other people, and I don't think that I knew everything that was shared in this. One particular thing that I found especially obvious, but then also I thought it was good to reflect on, is how much your environment affects your ability to be productive. And so I've been trying to add those things in a little bit, and in general, just trying to be more aware of the things that I'm doing that aren't helpful and trying to cut down on that while trying to encourage myself to do the things that are helpful. Like I said, stuff that probably seems obvious at surface level, but then if you really take the time to reflect, you more than likely could learn a few things. Next up, okay, I had buddy reads set up for the whole year, one a month, with my friend Jessie from the channel Jessie May. And the first one, we didn't particularly care for. That would be Ruin of Kings. So we did a live show for it. We talked for a very long time. And both of us are, I would say, rather nice people who are honest, but also don't want to be mean. So it's like an hour long of us being like, yeah, I mean, like, it's not for us, but also, like, you know, we didn't like it. It is going to be appealing to some people, just by the very nature of the fact that it is kind of unique in its setup. So you know those stories that are like, I'm going to tell you my life story. This book's like, you, prisoner, are going to tell me your life story. And they're like, I don't want to. And they're like, fine, I will tell your life story. And they're like, I'll tell my life story too then. So two different people are telling this person's life story, one of which is the person whose life you are following, and then one of them is someone else telling their life story. But you start in different places. So you have two different timelines, and then on top of that, you have footnotes from a different perspective. Everybody ends up being someone else. The whole book is, you thought this person was this person, actually this person is that person, and that other person too. And this person that you thought was this person's mother is actually their grandmother. Kind of a vibe. Not that exact thing, I'm trying not to spoil stuff, but yeah, everything is like, JK, you thought this was real, it's not. And on top of that, sometimes the book is like, this is how the magic is. And then the footnotes, it's like, actually, that's not how the magic is. But these people don't know because they're stupid. And then you're like, wait a second, so that's not how the magic is? And then you're reading the whole book and you're like, they're still thinking that this is how the magic is. Is it though? Who am I to believe? All over the place. It's all over the place. And I was thinking the back and forth of telling you my life story was going to last for a little bit because it starts out with part 1. And then part 1 lasts for 480 pages. And then the last chunk is part 2. And that part was, I was like, okay, you know what? It's pulling me back in. And then new things were introduced. There were so many things to this book. And I was like, oh, what is this demon realm thing? And like the dragon heart stuff. And there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. So if you like a lot going on in your fantasy books, there definitely is. The writing is good. I think the writing, the mechanics of the writing, the crafting of the sentences, that sort of thing, I liked that a lot. Telling you the life story, I didn't mind that. It was just that there was so much information that I was like, do we need this? And then there'd be other things that come up. I'm like, this is cool. And we spend some time with it, or we gloss over it. And I just didn't get to dive into the things about this book that I thought were interesting as much as I would have liked. And then some things that I didn't find as interesting is where I found us focusing it the most. And so it just wasn't for me. I won't dive into these last two too much because one of them, Hall of Smoke, I did a dedicated review for, and then the other one, like I said, I had a video where I talked about new releases, and this one I talked quite a bit about. So I'm going to be brief with these. They're both new, like I was saying. Hall of Smoke is a Viking-esque warrior priestess who is grieving and also trying to survive, and also kind of gets caught in the middle of a battle between the gods. It is single point of view, adult fantasy, and I quite enjoyed it. And then Mask of Mirrors. So Mask of Mirrors is not as crazy as the Ruin of Kings, but it was not the easiest to follow. It is newer, so I haven't seen too many people talk about it, but for the people who have read it already, I'm relieved to see that I am not the only person that was like, WTF, for most of the book. So we follow a character who's a con artist, and they are trying to con their way into a noble family so that they don't just steal from them, they can be accepted into the family by pretending to be a long-lost relative, and then they have access to all of their prestige and money and power. They don't really know that this house is financially kind of collapsing, and they're barely hanging in there, and they kind of get caught up in the house politics and the city politics. There's a lot of different perspectives right off the bat, and they're all interwoven very closely, so that made it a little difficult to know who was who. It also is very intense on the fantasy names. They're not the easiest, but the more into the story you get, the more you kind of, you're digging the like little tiny things, like this person said this, but like actually it was really insulting, even though they didn't come right out and say something insulting. And it's a lot of maneuvering and trying to scam people and scheming. But then the magic starts to come in more, and that's where I was like, I don't know what's going on, like at all. I don't know what's happening. But I didn't mind. I still enjoyed it. I'm definitely interested in what happens next. And I think if you're in the mood for something with a city house political maneuvering type of situation, I think you'll like this one. That's it for my January wrap up. I'll have all the other links in the description bar if you want to see some of these a little bit more in depth. There are a couple I have mentioned that I want to do in-depth reviews for. Hopefully I can get that accomplished. But anyway, let me know how your January reading went. What was your favorite thing you read? Your least favorite thing? Have you read any of the ones I mentioned? I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.